The hammer fell with a crack that echoed across the parched town square, silencing the murmuring crowd. Caleb squinted, the desert sun baking the sweat on his brow. He watched Jedediah, the auctioneer, wipe his forehead with a greasy rag, already moving on to the next item. His saddle. His stomach twisted. That saddle was all he had left of his father, a worn piece of leather and wood that had carried him across half of Texas. Sarah stood at the edge of the crowd, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. Dust devils danced around her ankles, mirroring the turmoil in her heart. Her husband, Thomas, had been a good man, but bad luck followed him like a shadow. A drought had withered their crops, and a sickness had taken him too soon, leaving her with a mountain of debt and nothing to pay it with but the pitiful contents of their small homestead. She'd already watched their mule, their plow, and even Thomas's prized pocket watch go under the hammer. Now, only a few household items remained. The auctioneer's voice boomed, "Now, gentlemen, here's a saddle fit for a king. Fine leather, sturdy frame, a true testament to the craftsmanship of the West." He held it up, the sun glinting off the worn leather. Caleb felt a lump form in his throat. He knew the saddle wasn't worth much, not in terms of coin, but it held memories, stories whispered in the creak of the leather, the rhythm of a horse's gait across the plains. A rancher, Silas Harding, a man whose belly strained against his embroidered vest, stepped forward, a sneer plastered on his face. He was known for preying on the misfortune of others, gobbling up their land and possessions like a hungry wolf. "I'll start the bidding at $5, he drawled, his voice thick with arrogance. A few hesitant bids followed, but Harding quickly outbid them, his eyes fixed on Caleb, a cruel glint in them. He knew the saddle meant something to the man, and that made it all the more appealing to him. Caleb stood frozen, his hands clenched at his sides. He'd come to terms with losing everything else, but this felt like losing a piece of himself. He closed his eyes, picturing his father's weathered face, the calloused hands that had taught him to ride, to rope, to survive in this unforgiving land. The bidding stalled. Harding, with a triumphant smirk, raised his hand. $10, he declared, his voice ringing with finality. Silence hung heavy in the air. Jedediah looked around expectantly, his hammer poised to fall. Caleb's shoulders slumped. It was over. Then, a voice, clear and strong, cut through the silence. $11. All our eyes turned to Sarah. She stood tall, her chin lifted, her gaze unwavering. The crowd gasped. A woman, and a pregnant one at that, bidding against Silas Harding. It was unheard of. Harding's face flushed crimson. "What's this, little lady? You think you can outbid me?" Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "I have $11. That's my bid." Jedediah, momentarily stunned, recovered quickly. $11? Do I hear 12? He looked at Harding, who was clearly taken aback by the unexpected challenge. Harding hesitated. He could easily outbid her, but something in her eyes, a quiet strength, gave him pause. He knew the townsfolk were watching, and he didn't want to appear to be bullying a pregnant widow. "Let her have it," he spat, turning away in disgust. "It ain't worth the trouble." Jedediah, surprised, slammed the hammer down. "Sold! To the lady for $11. Caleb stared at Sarah, bewildered. Why would she do this? She had nothing. Sarah walked towards Caleb, her steps slow but deliberate. She reached him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. My Thomas. He always said a man's saddle was his most prized possession, she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. I know what it means to lose something precious. She pulled a small, worn pouch from her pocket and counted out $11, handing them to Jedediah. Then she turned back to Caleb, offering him the saddle. He looked at the saddle, then at Sarah, his eyes searching hers for an explanation. She simply shook her head. Keep it, she said. You need it more than I do. Caleb was speechless. He wanted to refuse, to tell her she needed the money more than he needed the saddle. But he saw the resolve in her eyes, the quiet strength that radiated from her. He knew arguing would be futile. He took the saddle, his fingers tracing the worn leather, the familiar shape of the horn. He looked at Sarah, his heart filled with gratitude he couldn't express. Thank you, he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. She offered him a faint smile. You're welcome. She paused, then added, Maybe someday you can tell me stories about where that saddle has been. He nodded, unable to speak. He watched as she walked away, her figure silhouetted against the setting sun, a small beacon of hope in the vast, unforgiving landscape. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. As Sarah led Caleb away from the bustling town square, dust swirled around them, clinging to their clothes and skin, a constant reminder of the harsh reality of their existence. They walked in silence, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the parched earth. Sarah's homestead was a small, weathered cabin a few miles outside town, a testament to Thomas's hard work and her own resilience. A small, struggling vegetable patch lay wilting beside it, a silent testament to the drought that had gripped the land. The air hung heavy with the scent of dust and dry grass, a stark contrast to the bustling energy of the town. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished, a single table and 2 chairs, a rickety bed in the corner, and a small fireplace that served as both stove and heater. The walls were bare, save for a faded photograph of Thomas, his face etched with the lines of hard work and a gentle smile that still brought tears to Sarah's eyes. She busied herself preparing a simple meal, her movements slow and deliberate. Caleb stood awkwardly in the doorway, his saddle resting on the floor beside him. He watched her, his gaze filled with a mixture of gratitude and concern. He knew she had little to spare, yet she was offering him what she had. Sarah placed a pot of beans on the fire, the aroma filling the small cabin. She sliced a loaf of bread, its crust hard and dry. It ain't much, she said, her voice soft, but it's all I have to offer. Caleb shook his head. It's more than enough, he replied, his voice rough with emotion. Thank you. They ate in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the clinking of their spoons against the tin plates. The beans were simple, seasoned only with salt and pepper, but they tasted like a feast to Caleb. He hadn't had a proper meal in days, and the warmth of the food filled his empty stomach and eased the gnawing anxiety in his heart. Sarah watched him as he ate, her eyes filled with a quiet concern. She could see the weariness in his face, the desperation in his eyes. She knew he was down on his luck, just like so many others in this unforgiving land. Where will you go now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb shrugged. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe head north, try my luck in Montana, or maybe west, towards California. Anywhere's better than here. Sarah nodded, understanding his restlessness. She knew the feeling of being trapped, of wanting to escape the harsh realities of their lives. "It's a hard life," she said, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. "Especially for a man alone." Caleb looked at her, his gaze softening. "It's a hard life for everyone," he replied. "But you're stronger than you think." Sarah managed a faint smile. "I have to be," she said, "for the little one." They finished their meal in silence, the unspoken weight of their circumstances hanging heavy in the air. Caleb helped Sarah clear the table, his movements careful and respectful. He knew she was carrying a heavy burden, both physically and emotionally. As he prepared to leave, he hesitated, his hand resting on the saddle. "Sarah," he said, his voice filled with gratitude, "I don't know how to thank you." She shook her head. "You don't have to," she replied. "Just be careful out there. And don't give up." Caleb nodded, his heart filled with a renewed sense of determination. He slung the saddle over his shoulder and walked towards the door, pausing for a moment to look back at Sarah. "Thank you," he said again, his voice barely audible. She offered him a small smile, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. "Godspeed," she whispered. Caleb stepped out into the darkness, the vast expanse of the desert stretching before him. The stars twinkled overhead, offering a faint glimmer of hope in the darkness. He mounted his horse, the familiar feel of the saddle beneath him a source of comfort. He turned his horse north, towards the unknown, his heart filled with a mixture of fear and anticipation. He knew the road ahead would be long and hard, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. He carried with him the memory of Sarah's kindness, a small beacon of hope in the vast, unforgiving landscape. Sarah watched him ride away, her figure silhouetted against the warm glow of the cabin. She knew she might never see him again, but she would never forget his face, the gratitude in his eyes, the silent understanding that had passed between them. She closed the door, the sound echoing in the small cabin. She walked over to the bed and lay down, her hand resting on her belly. She felt the gentle flutter of life within her, a reminder of the hope that still existed, even in the face of hardship. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and whistling through the cracks in the walls. Sarah closed her eyes, listening to the sounds of the desert, the wild, untamed symphony of the West. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she also knew that she was strong, that she could endure. She had to, for herself, for her child, and for the memory of Thomas, the man who had taught her to love this land, to respect its power, and to never give up hope, no matter how dark the night. The saddle, though unseen, felt like a promise whispered on the wind, a testament to the enduring spirit of the West, where even in the face of despair, a small act of kindness could make all the difference. The next morning, Caleb was up before dawn, the eastern sky barely hinting at the coming sun. He found Sarah already tending to the meager vegetable patch, her movements slow but determined. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dry earth. He watched her for a moment, a silent observer, before approaching. "Morning," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Sarah looked up, her face etched with fatigue. "Morning, Caleb. I didn't expect to see you still around." He shrugged, his gaze sweeping over the dilapidated fence surrounding the garden. "Figured I could lend a hand before I head out. Fence looks like it's seen better days." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "It could use some mending. The rabbits are getting bolder every day." Caleb retrieved his saddlebags from where he'd left them, near the porch, and pulled out a coil of wire and a pair of pliers. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his hands sure and steady, as he examined the damaged sections of the fence. Sarah watched him, her eyes narrowed in thought. There was a competence about him, a knowledge of the land and its hardships, that belied his rough appearance. He worked in silence, methodically splicing the broken wires, tightening the posts, and reinforcing the weak spots. The rhythmic clang of the pliers against the wire was the only sound, punctuated by the occasional sigh of the wind. Sarah continued to tend to her vegetables, pulling weeds and watering the thirsty plants. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the parched landscape, Caleb's shirt became soaked with sweat. He paused, wiping his brow with a forearm, his gaze sweeping over the surrounding land. He saw the dry creek bed, the cracked earth, the stunted trees struggling to survive. It was a harsh and unforgiving place, but there was a stark beauty to it, a resilience that mirrored Sarah's own. "This land, it's tough," he said, his voice barely audible. Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on the wilting leaves of a tomato plant. "It is. Thomas always said it takes a special kind of person to make a life out here." Caleb resumed his work, his movements growing more deliberate, as if he were trying to imprint the image of the land onto his memory. He worked for several hours, mending the fence until it was as sturdy as he could make it. When he was finished, he stood back, surveying his handiwork. "That should keep the rabbits out for a while," he said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. Sarah walked over to the fence, running her hand along the taut wires. "Thank you, Caleb. I appreciate it more than you know." He shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "It was nothing." "It wasn't nothing," Sarah insisted. "It was a kindness, something I haven't seen much of lately." She turned to him, her eyes searching his. "Why are you doing this? You could be miles away by now, heading towards a new life. Why stay and help me?" Caleb hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. He didn't have an answer, not one he could easily articulate. He didn't know why he'd stayed. Maybe it was gratitude for her generosity with the saddle. Maybe it was the quiet strength he saw in her eyes. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the feeling that he was finally doing something right, something that mattered. I don't know," he stammered, his voice rough with uncertainty. "I just felt like it." Sarah studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She saw the haunted look in his eyes, the deep lines etched into his face, the calluses on his hands that spoke of a life lived in hard labor. She sensed a deeper story beneath his rough exterior, a history he carried silently, like a burden. "You've seen a lot, haven't you?" she asked, her voice gentle. Caleb flinched, as if she'd struck a nerve. He turned away, his shoulders stiff. "Everyone's seen something," he muttered. He walked towards the well, a rickety wooden structure that creaked with every turn of the crank. He grabbed the bucket and began to draw water, his movements mechanical, as if he were trying to escape the conversation. As he hauled the heavy bucket up from the depths, Sarah noticed the way he handled the rope, the expert knotting, the precise movements. He knew how to work with rope, how to handle livestock, how to survive in the wilderness. He was a man of the land, a man who had spent his life working with his hands. She watched him as he watered the vegetables, his movements careful and deliberate. He seemed to know exactly how much water each plant needed, how to coax life from the parched earth. "You're good with horses, aren't you?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence. Caleb paused, his hand resting on the handle of the bucket. He looked at her, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Why do you ask?" "I saw the way you handled your horse yesterday," she replied. "You have a way with them, like you understand them." He shrugged, his gaze shifting away from hers. "I've been around horses my whole life," he said. "It's nothing special." But Sarah could see the truth in his eyes, the connection he had with the animals. It was a connection that ran deep, a bond forged through years of shared hardship and mutual respect. "Thomas used to train horses," she said, her voice filled with a hint of nostalgia. "He had a real gift for it. He could calm the wildest Mustang with just a touch." Caleb remained silent, his gaze fixed on the ground. He knew what it was like to work with horses, to feel the power and grace of the animals beneath him. He knew the bond that could form between a man and his horse, a bond that could last a lifetime. He finished watering the vegetables and set the bucket down with a sigh. He turned to Sarah, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and regret. "I should be going," he said, his voice low. "I don't want to overstay my welcome." Sarah nodded, understanding his need to move on. She knew he couldn't stay here forever, that he had his own path to follow, his own demons to confront. "Thank you, Caleb," she said, her voice soft, "for everything." He offered her a faint smile, a fleeting glimpse of the man beneath the rough exterior. "You're welcome, Sarah. Take care of yourself." He turned and walked towards his horse, his saddle slung over his shoulder. He mounted the horse, his movements fluid and graceful. He looked back at Sarah one last time, his eyes filled with a silent understanding. Then he turned his horse north and rode away, leaving Sarah standing alone in the dusty yard, the wind whispering through the dry grass, carrying the ghosts of the past and the scars of the land. She watched him until he disappeared over the horizon, a solitary figure against the vast expanse of the west. The kindness he showed her, though small, felt like a shield against the harshness of her reality, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope could still bloom. Days bled into weeks. The sun beat down mercilessly on Sarah's small homestead, baking the earth and withering what little remained of her garden. She was running low on supplies, and the thought of venturing into town filled her with dread. The town's curiosity had become a palpable weight, a suffocating blanket of speculation. She hitched up the old mule to the rickety wagon, its joints protesting with every step. The mule, aptly named Grumble, seemed to share her reluctance. Sarah patted its flank, offering a silent apology. "Just a quick trip, old friend," she murmured. In and out. The ride into town was slow and dusty, the wagon wheels churning up a cloud of red earth that clung to her skin and clothes. As she approached the outskirts, she could feel the familiar tightening in her chest, the anticipation of the stares and whispers that awaited her. She pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store, the wooden planks groaning under the weight. As she stepped down, she could feel the eyes on her, the subtle shifts in conversation, the barely concealed curiosity. She ignored them, focusing on her task, drawing strength from the life growing within her. Inside the store, Mr. Abernathy, the storekeeper, greeted her with a mixture of sympathy and polite curiosity. "Morning, Sarah," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "What can I get for you today?" Sarah recited her list, her voice barely above a whisper. Flour, sugar, coffee, salt, the bare necessities. Mr. Abernathy gathered the items, his movements slow and deliberate. As he tallied the bill, he cleared his throat. "Heard you had a visitor," he said, his eyes avoiding hers. Sarah's heart sank. The whispers had already reached him. "Just passing through," she replied, her voice tight. Mr. Abernathy nodded, his expression unreadable. "Caleb, was it? Seems like a decent sort." Sarah didn't reply, focusing on counting out the meager coins she had saved. She paid the bill and gathered her supplies, her movements hurried and awkward. As she turned to leave, Mrs. Henderson, the town gossip, approached her, her eyes gleaming with morbid curiosity. "Sarah, dear," she cooed, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Such a kind heart you have, taking in strangers like that, especially in your condition." Sarah gritted her teeth, resisting the urge to snap. "He needed help," she said, her voice flat. Mrs. Henderson clucked her tongue. "Well, you be careful, dear. You never know what kind of trouble those drifters can bring." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Heard tell he was heading north, towards Blackwood territory." Sarah didn't reply, pushing past Mrs. Henderson and hurrying out of the store. She loaded her supplies into the wagon, her hands trembling with anger and frustration. She hated the gossip, the suspicion, the constant scrutiny. All she had done was offer a little kindness, and now she was being judged for it. As she drove the wagon down the main street, she overheard snippets of conversation, fragments of rumors and speculation. "Wealthy family, lost heir, vanished years ago." Sarah dismissed it as idle chatter, the usual small-town gossip. She had more pressing concerns than the affairs of wealthy families. She needed to get back to her homestead, to tend to her garden, to prepare for the coming birth. But the rumors lingered in the back of her mind, a nagging unease that she couldn't shake. As she drove further away from town, the landscape began to change, the rolling hills giving way to rugged canyons and towering mesas. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. She passed a group of cowboys driving a herd of cattle, their faces weathered and grim. They eyed her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, their silence more unnerving than any words. She pushed Grumble onward, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The sun was beginning to dip below the mesas, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. She knew she needed to reach her homestead before nightfall. As she rounded a bend in the road, she saw a lone figure standing by the side of the trail. He was tall and lean, dressed in a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He looked vaguely familiar. As she drew closer, she recognized him. It was a man she'd seen talking to the saloon owner a few times. He was a stranger in town, like Caleb, but unlike the rancher, this man exuded an air of quiet authority, a sense of purpose that set him apart. He was watching her with an intensity that made her uneasy. She pulled the wagon to a stop, her heart pounding in her chest. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man stepped forward, his face hidden in the shadows of his hat. "I'm looking for someone," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "A man named Caleb." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She knew she shouldn't say anything, that she should just drive away and forget she had ever seen him. But something in his eyes, a hint of desperation, made her hesitate. I saw him pass through town," she said, her voice trembling. "He was heading north." The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "Do you know where he was going?" Sarah shook her head. "No, he didn't say." The man stared at her for a long moment, his gaze piercing. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the canyon. Sarah watched him go, her mind racing. Who was he? And why was he looking for Caleb? The rumors of the wealthy family The lost air suddenly seemed less like idle gossip and more like a piece of a larger, more dangerous puzzle. She urged Grumble forward, her pace quickening. She needed to get home, to protect herself and her unborn child from whatever was coming. She didn't know Caleb, but she knew that his brief passage through her life had stirred something in the town, something that felt both unsettling and inevitable. The West, she knew, was full of secrets, and some were best left buried. The first drops of rain felt like bullets against the dry earth, kicking up dust devils that swirled around Sarah's wagon. She urged Grumble onward, the little mule straining against the harness, the wind whipping at her face. The sky, moments ago a canvas of fiery hues, had turned a bruised purple, the air thick with the smell of ozone and impending storm. She barely made it back to the homestead before the heavens opened. The rain came down in sheets, turning the dry creek bed into a raging torrent, the wind howling like a banshee. She unhitched Grumble, leading him into the small lean-to beside the cabin, securing him with a rope. Then she scrambled inside, slamming the door shut against the fury of the storm. The cabin was small, but it felt like a sanctuary against the chaos outside. The fire she'd laid earlier crackled merrily in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. She quickly secured the shutters, blocking out the worst of the wind and rain. The storm raged on, the thunder echoing through the canyons, the lightning illuminating the landscape in brief, blinding flashes. She huddled by the fire, wrapped in a thick blanket, listening to the roar of the storm. It was a powerful, untamed force, a reminder of the raw, unforgiving nature of the West. She felt a shiver run down her spine, a primal fear that went beyond the storm itself. She was alone, pregnant, and vulnerable, at the mercy of the elements and whatever else the West might throw her way. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed above the din of the storm. Sarah jumped, her heart pounding in her chest. Who could be out in this weather? She hesitated, peering through a crack in the shutters. The rain obscured her view, but she could make out a figure huddled against the porch, soaked to the bone. She cautiously opened the door, the wind and rain blasting into the cabin. Standing there, dripping wet and shivering, was Caleb. "Caleb!" she exclaimed, surprised. "What are you doing here?" He shook his head, water streaming down his face. "Couldn't outrun the storm," he shouted over the wind. "Saw your light. Thought I'd ask for shelter." Sarah hesitated for only a moment. She couldn't leave him out in this weather. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "Get out of the rain." Caleb stumbled inside, shaking the water from his coat. He looked exhausted and bedraggled, a far cry from the stoic figure she'd seen riding away just days before. "Sorry to bother you, Sarah," he said, his voice hoarse. "Didn't mean to intrude." "Don't be silly," she replied, closing the door and securing the shutters again. "You'd have froze to death out there." She gestured towards the fire. "Get warmed up. I'll find you something dry to wear." She rummaged through Thomas's old clothes, finding a worn shirt and a pair of trousers that were slightly too big for Caleb. He changed quickly, his movements stiff with cold. As he sat by the fire, warming his hands, Sarah watched him, her mind racing. What had brought him back? Was he running from something? Or was he drawn back by something he couldn't explain? The storm raged on, trapping them together in the small cabin. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on their faces. The silence between them was thick with unspoken questions and anxieties. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "Thank you, Caleb," she said, her voice soft, "for for being here." He looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "You don't have to thank me," he replied. I'm just glad to be out of the storm." But Sarah knew it was more than that. She could see it in his eyes, the quiet strength, the unspoken understanding. He was a man of few words, but his presence was a comfort, a reassurance that she wasn't completely alone. As the hours passed, the storm showed no signs of abating. The wind howled, the rain beat against the shutters, and the thunder shook the cabin to its foundations. They huddled by the fire, sharing stories, their voices barely audible above the roar of the storm. Sarah found herself confiding in Caleb, sharing her fears and anxieties about raising a child alone. She told him about Thomas, about their dreams for the future, about the hardships they had faced, and the love that had sustained them. It's just so hard, Caleb," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I don't know if I can do this alone. I'm scared." Caleb listened patiently, his gaze fixed on the fire. He didn't offer empty platitudes or false promises. He simply listened, offering her the quiet comfort of his presence. When she was finished, he remained silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "I know what it's like to be alone," he said, "to feel like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." He paused, his gaze shifting away from hers. My life wasn't always like this," he continued, his voice hesitant. I came from a different world." Sarah looked at him, surprised. She had assumed he was just another drifter, another wanderer, seeking his fortune in the West. But there was something in his voice, a hint of refinement, that suggested otherwise. "What do you mean?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. Caleb hesitated, as if reluctant to reveal his past. But the storm raged on, trapping them together in the small cabin, forcing them to confront the secrets they had both been carrying. I grew up in the East," he said, his voice barely audible. "Wealthy family, privileged life, everything I could ever want." He paused, his expression hardening. "But it wasn't for me. I couldn't stand it. The hypocrisy, the greed, the endless pursuit of wealth and power." He looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and regret. "So, I left. I walked away from it all, came out west to make a life for myself, to be my own man." Sarah stared at him, stunned. She couldn't imagine walking away from such a life, from such privilege, but she could understand his desire for something more, for something real. And did you find it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb shrugged, his gaze shifting back to the fire. "Sometimes," he said. "Sometimes I think I did. Other times, I wonder if I made the right choice." The storm continued to rage, but inside the small cabin, a fragile connection had formed, a bond forged in the crucible of shared hardship and unspoken understanding. Sarah looked at Caleb, seeing him in a new light. He was more than just a drifter, more than just a kind stranger. He was a man with a past, a man with his own demons to confront, a man who had chosen a life of hardship and uncertainty over the comfort and security of his privileged upbringing. And in that moment, she understood him, perhaps better than she understood herself. The storm outside mirrored the storm within them both, a tempest of emotions that threatened to overwhelm them. But as they huddled by the fire, sharing their stories, they found a small measure of solace, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. The storm finally broke at dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and sparkling. The sun rose, painting the landscape in vibrant hues of gold and green. The air was crisp and fresh, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. Sarah emerged from the cabin, stretching her stiff muscles, breathing in the clean air. Caleb followed, his face etched with fatigue, but his eyes clear and alert. They surveyed the scene, taking in the damage the storm had wrought. The creek bed was still swollen. The fence around the garden was partially collapsed, and several trees had been uprooted. It was a daunting sight, a reminder of the constant struggle to survive in this harsh land. "Well, looks like we have our work cut out for us," Sarah said, her voice laced with a weary determination. Caleb nodded. "I'll help you fix the fence. Grumble, okay?" "He's fine. Shook up some, but fine." They started to gather the fallen branches, working in silence, their movements efficient and coordinated. As they worked, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. The storm had passed, but the man's visit the day before still weighed on her. She glanced at Caleb, wondering if she should tell him about the man who was looking for him, but she hesitated, unsure of his reaction. She didn't want to pry into his past, but she also didn't want to be caught off guard if trouble came looking for him. As they were clearing debris near the edge of the property, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, growing larger with alarming speed. Sarah squinted, shielding her eyes from the sun. As the cloud drew closer, she could make out the shapes of horses and riders, their silhouettes growing larger against the clear sky. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had a bad feeling about this. The riders approached the homestead, their horses kicking up dust and gravel. They were led by a large, imposing man with a grizzled beard and a cold, hard gaze. Sarah recognized him instantly. It was Jedediah Blackwood, the wealthy rancher from the auction. He reined in his horse in front of the cabin, his eyes sweeping over the scene with disdain. "Well, well, well," he said, his voice booming. "Looks like the little widow woman has company." Sarah stepped forward, her chin lifted defiantly. "What do you want, Blackwood?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. Jedediah chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. "I'm here to collect what's owed to me," he said, his eyes fixed on Caleb. Caleb stepped forward, his face hardening. "I don't owe you anything, Blackwood," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Jedediah dismounted, his bulk casting a long shadow over Sarah. "That's where you're wrong, Drifter," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "You owe me a debt your pa left behind, and I intend to collect." Sarah looked from Caleb to Jedediah, her mind racing. She knew that Jedediah was a ruthless man, a man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. She also knew that Caleb was hiding something that had brought Jedediah all the way to her homestead. "I don't know what you're talking about," Caleb said, his voice tight. "My father never borrowed a dime from you." Jedediah sneered. "Oh, but he did. Signed a note, clear as day, and since he's no longer around to pay it, the debt falls to you." He paused, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Of course, I'm a reasonable man. I'm willing to offer you a way out. You work for me for a year, hard labor, sun up to sundown. That'll cover the debt with interest." Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She knew what Jedediah was doing. He wasn't interested in the money. He wanted to control Caleb, to break him, to make him pay for whatever perceived slight his father had committed. Caleb stared at Jedediah, his face a mask of fury. "I'd rather die than work for you," he said, his voice trembling with rage. Jedediah shrugged. "That's your choice," he said. "But if you don't agree to my terms, I'll take everything. The land, the cabin, the mule, everything. And the widow here will be left with nothing." Sarah felt a surge of anger, a fierce protectiveness for her unborn child. She wouldn't let Jedediah take everything from her, not after everything she had already lost. "You can't do that," she said, her voice trembling, but firm. "This land is mine. I homesteaded it." Jedediah laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "And who's going to stop me?" he said. "The law, the sheriff's in my pocket. You think anyone out here cares about a lone woman and her bastard child?" He stepped closer to Sarah, his eyes filled with contempt. "You're nothing, Sarah. Just a piece of dirt. And I can crush you any time I want." Caleb stepped in front of Sarah, shielding her from Jedediah's gaze. "Get away from her," he said, his voice low and menacing. Jedediah smirked. "Or what, Drifter? You going to fight me? You and what army?" He gestured to his men, who were now surrounding the cabin, their faces grim and menacing. "I got a dozen men here, all armed to the teeth. You think you can take us on?" Caleb didn't answer. He simply stood there, his eyes fixed on Jedediah, his body tense and ready. Sarah could feel the anger radiating from him, the barely suppressed rage that threatened to erupt. "This has nothing to do with her," Caleb said, his voice tight. "Leave her out of this." Jedediah shrugged. "It's your choice," he repeated. "Agree to my terms, and I'll leave her alone. Refuse, and I'll take everything." The silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the wind and the rustling of leaves. Sarah watched Caleb, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew he was facing an impossible decision, a choice between his own freedom and her survival. The cowboy, who had stood silent throughout the entire exchange, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. He shifted slightly, his hand hovering near the handle of his revolver. The air crackled with tension, the weight of the decision pressed down on Caleb, visible in the tightening of his jaw, the flicker in his eyes. He glanced at Sarah, her face pale but resolute, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. He saw not just her vulnerability, but her strength, her unwavering spirit that had somehow weathered the storm of loss and hardship. He couldn't condemn her to further suffering. "All right," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I'll go." Sarah gasped, her eyes widening in disbelief. "No, Caleb, don't," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "You don't have to do this. We can fight him. We can find a way." Caleb shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "There's no fighting him, Sarah. Not now. He's got the law, the money, the men. We wouldn't stand a chance." He reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands. "But I won't let him hurt you. I won't let him take what's yours." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, streaming down her cheeks. "But what about you, Caleb? What will happen to you?" Caleb forced a smile, a weak attempt to reassure her. "I'll be all right. A year's hard labor won't kill me. And once it's over, I'll be free." He knew he was lying. He knew that Jedediah wouldn't let him go that easily. But he couldn't tell her the truth. He couldn't burden her with the knowledge of his past, the secrets that had brought Jedediah Blackwood to her doorstep. "Besides," he added, his voice softening, "he'll need me out of the way. If I'm here, he'll keep coming back, looking for ways to torment you. But if I'm gone, he'll lose interest. He'll move on." Sarah shook her head, her tears flowing freely. "I don't want you to go, Caleb," she sobbed. "I need you here. I can't do this alone." Caleb's heart ached at her words. He wanted nothing more than to stay, to protect her, to help her raise her child. But he knew he couldn't. He was a danger to her, a magnet for trouble. The best thing he could do was leave, to disappear from her life and let her rebuild in peace. He pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her close, burying his face in her hair. "I know it's hard, Sarah," he whispered, "but you're strong. You're stronger than you think. You can do this, and you won't be alone. You have Grumble. You have your neighbors. You have the little one." He paused, his voice catching in his throat. "And if you ever need anything at all, just send word. I'll come back. I promise." He pulled away, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and regret. He knew he was making the right decision, but it was tearing him apart. Jedediah watched them, his face impassive. "Enough with the sob story," he said, his voice impatient. "Let's go. Drifter, I haven't got all day." Caleb turned to Jedediah, his face hardening. "Give me a minute," he said, his voice low and dangerous. He walked over to Grumble, patting the mule's flank. "Take care of her, old friend," he murmured. "She's a good woman." He then turned back to Sarah, his eyes filled with a silent farewell. He wanted to say more, to tell her how much she meant to him, but the words caught in his throat. He simply nodded, his expression stoic. He mounted one of Jedediah's horses, his movements stiff and awkward. He wasn't a rider, not like these men. He was a city boy, a stranger to the ways of the West. But he would learn. He had to. He looked at Sarah one last time, his gaze lingering on her face. He wanted to memorize every detail, to carry her image with him wherever he went. Then he turned his horse and rode away, following Jedediah and his men. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Sarah watched him go, her heart shattering into a million pieces. She felt a sense of despair wash over her, a feeling of utter helplessness. She was alone again, facing an uncertain future, with no one to turn to but herself. As Caleb disappeared over the horizon, the cowboy finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "He did what he thought was right," he said, his eyes fixed on Sarah. "Whether it was or not, well, that remains to be seen." Sarah didn't reply. She simply stood there, watching the dust settle, her tears mingling with the dirt on her face. The West, she knew, was a cruel and unforgiving place, and sometimes the only way to survive was to make the impossible choice, to sacrifice your own happiness for the sake of someone else. Jedediah led Caleb away from the homestead, the group riding in silence for what felt like hours. The landscape was unforgiving, the sun beating down relentlessly. Caleb's city-softened hands were already raw from gripping the reins, his body aching from the unaccustomed strain. He glanced at Jedediah, trying to gauge his mood, but the rancher's face was an unreadable mask. Finally, as they reached a desolate canyon, Jedediah reined in his horse. "All right, Drifter," he said, his voice harsh. "Time to set some ground rules." He dismounted, his men following suit. They formed a circle around Caleb, their faces grim and menacing. "You're working for me now," Jedediah continued, his eyes fixed on Caleb. "You do what I say, when I say it. No questions asked. You disobey me. You'll regret it. Understand?" Caleb nodded, his jaw tight. He knew he was at Jedediah's mercy, but he refused to show any fear. "Good," Jedediah said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Now, let's get one thing straight. I don't trust you. I don't like you. And I'm going to make your life a living hell." He paused, his eyes gleaming with malice, But I'm also a man of my word. You work for me for a year, and I'll let you go. But if you try to run, if you try to cause trouble, I'll make sure you never see the light of day again." Caleb stared at Jedediah, his heart filled with hatred. He knew he was walking into a trap, but he had no choice. He had to protect Sarah, even if it meant sacrificing his own freedom. "Now," Jedediah said, his voice sharp, "get off that horse and start walking. We've got a long way to go." Caleb dismounted, his legs trembling with fatigue. He looked back in the direction of Sarah's homestead, his heart aching with longing. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he would never forget her. She was the only good thing that had happened to him in a long time, and he would do everything in his power to protect her, even from afar. He turned and started walking, following Jedediah and his men into the heart of the West, into a darkness that threatened to consume him. Weeks bled into months. Sarah wrestled with the silence, the absence a constant ache. She rebuilt the fence, planted the garden, and prepared for the coming birth. Each task a monument to her solitude. Grumble, sensing her mood, stayed close, his soft muzzle nudging her hand as if to offer comfort. One afternoon, a dust-covered rider appeared on the horizon, not Jedediah or his men, but a stranger, his clothes finer than most she'd seen out here. He rode up to the cabin, dismounting with a weariness that mirrored her own. He was young, clean-shaven, and held himself with an air of nervous authority. "Mrs. Thomas?" he asked, his voice carrying the clipped tones of the East. "Sarah Thomas?" She nodded, suspicion clouding her face. "I am. What do you want?" He cleared his throat, adjusting his spectacles. "I have something for Mr. Caleb Stone. Is he about?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Caleb. It had been so long. "He's away," she said, choosing her words carefully. "He's working. What is it?" The young man hesitated, glancing around the sparse homestead. "It's personal. I'm instructed to deliver it directly to him." Sarah felt a surge of protectiveness, a fierce desire to shield Caleb from whatever this man represented. "He's not here," she repeated, her voice firm. "If it's important, you can leave it with me. I'll see that he gets it." After a moment of internal debate, the rider relented. He reached into his saddlebag and produced a thick, sealed envelope, its paper heavy and expensive. "Very well," he said, handing it to her. "But it's imperative that he receives this as soon as possible. It concerns a matter of considerable importance." He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at her with a hint of pity in his eyes. "My condolences, Mrs. Thomas, for your loss." He tipped his hat and rode off, leaving Sarah standing alone with the mysterious letter. She watched him disappear over the horizon, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. What could be so important that a man would travel all this way to deliver it? And why did he offer his condolences? She retreated into the cabin, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. She turned it over and over, examining the seal, the fine paper, the elegant script. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. It spoke of a world far removed from her own, a world of wealth and privilege, a world that Caleb had seemingly abandoned. She knew she shouldn't, that the letter wasn't meant for her. But curiosity and a deep-seated fear for Caleb's safety gnawed at her. She found Thomas's old knife, the blade worn but still sharp, and carefully slit the seal. Inside was a letter, penned in the same elegant script as the address, and several legal documents filled with dense, unfamiliar language. She began to read, her brow furrowing in confusion. The letter began with a formal greeting, addressing Mr. Caleb Stone, and identified the sender as a partner in a prestigious law firm in Boston. It then proceeded to inform Caleb of his father's death. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Caleb's father? Dead? She hadn't even known he had a family. He had spoken so little of his past, painting himself as a lone wanderer, a man without ties or obligations. But the letter didn't end there. It went on to explain that Caleb was the sole heir to his father's considerable fortune, a vast estate that included land, businesses, and a substantial amount of money. He was, in essence, a very wealthy man. Sarah sank into a chair, the letter trembling in her hand. She couldn't believe what she was reading. Caleb, the quiet, unassuming drifter who had helped her through the storm, was actually a wealthy heir, a man who had walked away from a life of privilege and comfort. The legal documents confirmed everything. Deeds, titles, and financial statements, all bearing Caleb's name. It was all there, in black and white. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over her, relief that he was, in some ways, safe. Anger that he had kept such a vital part of himself from her. Hurt that he seemingly hadn't trusted her with the truth. Why hadn't he told her? Was he ashamed of his past? Did he think she wouldn't understand? Or did he simply not care enough to share such a significant part of his life with her? She reread the letter, searching for clues, for some explanation for his silence, but there was nothing. The letter was cold and impersonal, a business transaction, devoid of any emotion. The cowboy, who was outside tending to grumble, noticed her distress. He stepped into the cabin, his face etched with concern. "Something wrong, Sarah?" he asked, his voice low. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. She couldn't hold it in any longer. She handed him the letter, her hand shaking. "Read this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You won't believe it." The cowboy took the letter, his brow furrowing as he scanned the words. He read it slowly, deliberately, his expression unchanging. When he was finished, he handed it back to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of understanding and pity. "Well," he said, his voice quiet. "Seems like our Mr. Stone ain't quite who he said he was." Sarah nodded, her tears flowing freely. "I don't understand," she sobbed. "Why didn't he tell me? Why did he lie?" The cowboy shrugged. "Maybe he had his reasons," he said. "Maybe he was trying to protect you. Or maybe he just didn't want you to know." He paused, his gaze softening. "But one thing's for sure, Sarah. This changes things." Sarah knew he was right. This changed everything. She looked down at the letter, the weight of its secrets heavy in her hand. She had a decision to make. Should she confront Caleb with the truth? Should she demand an explanation for his deception? Or should she simply let it go, accepting that he was a man of secrets, a man she would never truly understand? The answer, she knew, lay in her heart, and in the fate of the child she carried, a child who deserved to know the truth about their father, no matter how painful it might be. The cowboy watched Sarah wrestle with the letter, the silence in the cabin thick with unspoken questions. He knew Caleb's secret had thrown a wrench into everything, complicating a situation that was already fraught with danger and uncertainty. He also knew Sarah was strong, capable of making her own decisions. He wouldn't presume to tell her what to do. "What are you going to do, Sarah?" he asked finally, his voice gentle. Sarah looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "I don't know," she said, her voice cracking. "I need to talk to him. I need to understand why he didn't tell me." "He's working for Blackwood," the cowboy reminded her. "Getting to him won't be easy." Sarah nodded, her jaw tightening. "I know," she said, "but I have to try. I can't just sit here and do nothing." The cowboy studied her face, seeing the determination in her eyes. He knew she was serious. He also knew that she couldn't go alone. "All right," he said, his voice firm. "I'll go with you." Sarah looked at him, her eyes widening in surprise. "You will?" she asked. "But why? You don't have to do this." The cowboy shrugged. "Maybe I don't," he said, "but you're going to need someone to watch your back. And besides," he added, a hint of a smile playing on his lips, "I've got a score to settle with Jedediah Blackwood myself." The decision made, Sarah felt a surge of renewed determination. She packed a small bag with essentials, her movements purposeful and efficient. The cowboy saddled Grumble and his own horse, checking their gear with practiced ease. As they rode out of the homestead, Sarah glanced back at the cabin, a mix of emotions swirling within her. Fear, uncertainty, but also a sense of hope. She didn't know what she would find at Blackwood's ranch, but she knew she had to face it head on. The ride to Blackwood's ranch was long and arduous, the landscape stretching out before them in a seemingly endless expanse of dust and scrub. The cowboy rode in silence, his eyes scanning the horizon, ever watchful for danger. Sarah, lost in her thoughts, struggled to reconcile the image of Caleb as a wealthy heir with the man she had come to know and care for. As they approached the ranch, the sheer scale of it was overwhelming. A sprawling complex of buildings, corrals, and workshops, teeming with activity. It was a stark contrast to her humble homestead, a symbol of Blackwood's power and wealth. They rode up to the main gate, where 2 armed guards stood watch. "Halt!" one of them barked, his hand resting on the handle of his rifle. "What's your business?" "We're here to see Caleb Stone," the cowboy said, his voice calm and steady. The guard eyed them suspiciously. "Stone? He's just a hired hand. Blackwood doesn't allow visitors." "Tell Blackwood that Sarah Thomas is here to see him," the cowboy said, his voice leaving no room for argument. The guard hesitated, then nodded to his partner, who went to inform Blackwood. They waited in silence, the tension hanging heavy in the air. After what seemed like an eternity, Blackwood emerged from the main house, his face a mask of anger. "What do you want, woman?" he demanded, his voice booming. "I told you to stay away." "I need to talk to Caleb," Sarah said, her voice trembling but firm. "It's important," Blackwood sneered. "He's busy. He doesn't have time for your sob stories." "It's about his family," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. "His father, he's dead." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Sarah pulled the letter from her bag and held it out to him. "This came for him," she said. "It's from a law firm in Boston. It says that his father has died and that he's the sole heir to his estate." Blackwood snatched the letter from her hand, his face darkening with rage. He read it quickly, his eyes scanning the words. When he was finished, he crumpled it in his fist. "This is a lie," he snarled. "Stone is nothing but a drifter. He has no family, no money." "It's not a lie," Sarah insisted. "It's the truth. He's been lying to you, to everyone." Blackwood glared at her, his eyes filled with hatred. "Get off my property," he roared, "and take your lies with you. If I ever see you here again, I'll have you both shot." "I'm not leaving without Caleb," Sarah said, her voice resolute. "I need to talk to him." Blackwood smirked. "You want to talk to him? Fine. I'll bring him out here, but don't expect him to be happy to see you." He turned and shouted to his men, "Bring Stone out here." A few minutes later, Caleb was escorted out of the main house, his face bruised and battered, He looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and despair. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "what are you doing here?" "I came because of this," she said, holding up the crumpled letter. "I need to know why you didn't tell me." Caleb looked at Blackwood, his face hardening. "Don't do this, Sarah," he said. "It's not worth it." "It is worth it," Sarah said. "I deserve to know the truth." Blackwood stepped forward, his face a mask of fury. "Enough," he roared. "This is my ranch, and I'm tired of your games. Stone, get back to work. And you," he said, turning to Sarah, "get out of here before I lose my temper." Caleb looked at Sarah, his eyes pleading. "Please, Sarah," he said. "Just go." Sarah hesitated, torn between her desire to confront Caleb and her fear for his safety. She looked at the cowboy, who nodded his head slightly, signaling her to trust him. "All right," she said, her voice trembling. "I'll go, but I'll be back, Caleb. I promise." She turned and walked away, the cowboy following close behind. As they rode away from the ranch, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had left Caleb in danger. She knew that Blackwood wouldn't let him go easily, and she knew that she had to do something to help him, even if it meant putting her own life at risk. As they rode away from Blackwood's ranch, the dust swirling around them like a shroud, Sarah felt a growing sense of desperation. She had seen the fear in Caleb's eyes, the bruises on his face. She knew Blackwood was a dangerous man, capable of anything, and she knew she couldn't leave Caleb to face him alone. "We need to do something," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. "We can't just leave him there." The cowboy nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I know," he said, "but we can't take on Blackwood and his men by ourselves. We need help." "Where are we going to find help?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with doubt. "Everyone around here is afraid of Blackwood." "Not everyone," the cowboy said, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "There are folks in town who've had enough of Blackwood's bullying, folks who are tired of living in fear. We just need to convince them to stand up for what's right." They rode to the small town of Redemption, its dusty streets lined with weathered buildings and weary faces. Sarah had visited the town a few times, mostly to buy supplies, but she had never really felt like she belonged. She was an outsider, a widow with a troubled past. But now, she was desperate. They stopped at the saloon, the only place in town where people were likely to gather. The air inside was thick with smoke and the smell of stale beer. A few cowboys were playing cards in the corner, their faces grim and focused. A lone woman sat at the bar, nursing in a drink. The cowboy approached the barkeep, a burly man with a handlebar mustache. "We need to talk to the people of this town," he said, his voice low and serious. "It's about Jedediah Blackwood." The barkeep eyed them suspiciously. "Blackwood's a powerful man," he said. "You're playing with fire." "We know," the cowboy said, "but we can't stand by and watch him terrorize this town any longer. We need to do something." The barkeep hesitated, then nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll spread the word, but don't expect too much. Most folks are too scared to get involved." Within an hour, a small crowd had gathered in front of the saloon. Sarah stood beside the cowboy, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never spoken in public before, but she knew she had to do this for Caleb, for herself, for the future of redemption. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice trembling at first, but growing stronger with each word. She told them about Caleb, about his kindness and his courage. She told them about Blackwood's cruelty and his greed. And she told them about the letter, about Caleb's hidden past and his rightful inheritance. "Blackwood is holding Caleb prisoner," she said, her voice ringing with conviction, He's trying to steal his inheritance, to keep him enslaved. We can't let him get away with it. We need to stand up to him, to show him that we won't be bullied any longer." She paused, looking at the faces in the crowd. Some were skeptical. Some were afraid. But others were filled with a growing sense of anger and determination. "I know it's dangerous," she continued. "Blackwood has a lot of men, a lot of guns. But we have something that he doesn't have. We have justice on our side. We have the courage to stand up for what's right. And if we stand together, we can win." A murmur rippled through the crowd. A few people nodded their heads in agreement. An old farmer stepped forward, his face etched with years of hardship. "I'm with you," he said, his voice raspy but firm. "Blackwood's been squeezing us dry for too long. It's time we showed him who's boss." Another man stepped forward, a young blacksmith with a fiery glint in his eyes. "I'm in too," he said. "I'm tired of living in fear. I'm ready to fight." One by one, others joined in, their voices growing louder and more confident. A sense of unity and purpose filled the air. The people of Redemption, long cowed by Blackwood's tyranny, were finally ready to fight back. The cowboy smiled, his eyes filled with pride. He had seen the spark of rebellion in these people, and Sarah had fanned it into a flame. "All right," he said, his voice booming. "Let's get organized. We need to arm ourselves to plan our attack. We're going to Blackwood's ranch, and we're going to bring Caleb Stone home." They gathered weapons from their homes and businesses, rifles, shotguns, pitchforks, axes. They formed a makeshift militia, a ragtag army of farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers united by their shared desire for justice. As they rode towards Blackwood's ranch, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the rhythmic thud of hooves. Sarah rode at the front, her face set with determination. She was no longer just a widow, a victim of circumstance. She was a leader, a symbol of hope for the people of Redemption. As they approached the ranch, they saw that Blackwood's men were waiting for them, armed and ready. The gates were closed, the walls were fortified. A tense standoff ensued, the two sides facing each other across the dusty plain. Blackwood emerged from the main house, his face contorted with rage. "What is the meaning of this?" he roared. "Get off my property, or I'll open fire." "We're here for Caleb Stone," Sarah said, her voice clear and strong. "We know he's being held against his will. We want him released." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, cruel sound. "Stone is working for me," he said. "He's not going anywhere." "That's a lie," Sarah said. "He's the heir to a fortune. You're trying to steal his inheritance." Blackwood's face darkened. "You're trespassing," he said. "I'm giving you one last chance to leave. If you don't, I'll consider it an act of war." Sarah looked at the faces of her fellow townsfolk, their eyes filled with courage and resolve. She knew they were ready to fight. She took a deep breath and raised her voice. "We're not afraid of you, Blackwood," she said. "We're here to take back what's rightfully ours. Release Caleb Stone and we'll leave peacefully. But if you refuse, we're prepared to fight." The standoff continued, the tension building to a breaking point. The fate of Caleb Stone and the future of Redemption hung in the balance. The cowboy watched, his hand resting on the handle of his gun, ready to fight alongside Sarah and the people of Redemption. He knew this was going to be a long and bloody battle, but he also knew that they had a chance to win, to break Blackwood's grip on the town and bring justice to the West. And he knew that Sarah Thomas, the quiet widow who had found the courage to stand up for what's right, was the key to their success. Blackwood's laughter echoed across the dusty yard, a chilling prelude to the chaos that followed. "You want to fight? You'll get one," he snarled, and with a flick of his wrist, his men opened fire. The air exploded with the roar of gunfire, the crack of rifles and the boom of shotguns shattering the tense silence. The townsfolk, though outgunned, returned fire with a desperate courage, using wagons and outbuildings for cover. Sarah, heart pounding, crouched behind a water trough, loading and firing Thomas's old rifle with a newfound skill. The cowboy, a whirlwind of motion and deadly accuracy, moved from position to position, picking off Blackwood's men with cool precision. Inside the main house, Caleb heard the eruption of violence and knew he had to act. He had been biding his time, feigning compliance. But the sound of Sarah's voice, the sight of her standing against Blackwood, had ignited a fire within him. He knew this land, knew the layout of the ranch better than Blackwood's own men. He used the ensuing chaos as cover, slipping away from his guard and disappearing into the maze of corridors. He moved like a shadow, his years of wandering having honed his instincts. He knew Blackwood would be holed up in his office, calling the shots. He silently made his way there, avoiding the fray, his mind racing with a plan. Meanwhile, outside the gunfight raged on. The townsfolk, though outnumbered, were holding their own, their determination fueled by years of pent-up resentment. But they were taking heavy losses. Sarah saw Old Man Hemlock fall, clutching his chest, and a wave of grief washed over her. She knew she had to do something to turn the tide. Just then a figure emerged from the main house, a rifle in his hand. It was Caleb, his face grim, his eyes blazing with a fierce determination. He moved with a speed and agility that surprised everyone, taking out two of Blackwood's men before they even had a chance to react. "Get down!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the din of gunfire. "I know this place. Follow me." With Caleb leading the way, the townsfolk surged forward, their courage renewed. They used the terrain to their advantage, flanking Blackwood's men, cutting off their lines of communication. The tide of the battle began to turn. Blackwood, seeing his carefully laid plans unraveling, flew into a rage. He stormed out of his office, a revolver in each hand, his face a mask of fury. He spotted Caleb and Sarah, standing side by side, their eyes locked in a silent understanding. "You traitor!" he roared, firing wildly in their direction. "I'll kill you both!" Caleb reacted instantly, shoving Sarah out of the way and diving for cover. He returned fire, his shots precise and deadly. Blackwood, caught off guard, stumbled, one of Caleb's bullets grazing his arm. The cowboy, seeing his opportunity, moved swiftly. He circled around Blackwood, flanking him, and disarmed him with a swift kick to the wrist. Blackwood's revolvers clattered to the ground. "It's over, Blackwood," the cowboy said, his voice cold and unforgiving. "You're finished." Blackwood, defeated and humiliated, was dragged away by the townsfolk, his reign of terror finally at an end. The remaining Blackwood men, seeing their leader captured, quickly surrendered. A wave of relief washed over the town. The gunfight was over. They had won. Sarah rushed to Caleb, her eyes filled with concern. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice trembling. Caleb nodded, his face etched with exhaustion. "I'm fine," he said. "But are you hurt?" Sarah shook her head. "I'm all right," she said, "but I was so worried about you." They embraced, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them. The shared danger, the shared courage, had forged a connection that transcended words. The townsfolk gathered around them, their faces filled with gratitude and admiration. They had faced down Blackwood and his men, and they had emerged victorious. They had proven that even the smallest community could stand up to tyranny, that even the most ordinary people could find extraordinary courage when their freedom was at stake. With Blackwood in custody, the townsfolk began the long process of rebuilding their lives. They started by dismantling Blackwood's empire, redistributing his land and resources among the people of Redemption. They established a new system of governance, one based on fairness and justice, one that would prevent anyone from ever wielding the kind of power that Blackwood had abused. Caleb, now recognized as the rightful heir to his family's fortune, had a decision to make. He could return to Boston, to a life of wealth and privilege, or he could stay in Redemption with Sarah and the people who had risked their lives to save him. He looked at Sarah, her face radiant in the setting sun. He saw the strength in her eyes, the kindness in her heart. He knew that his place was here, with her, in this small town that had become his home. "I'm staying," he said, his voice firm. "This is where I belong." Sarah smiled, her heart filled with joy. She knew that their life together wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges ahead, hardships to overcome, but they would face them together as a family, bound by love and loyalty. The cowboy, watching them from a distance, smiled to himself. He had seen a lot of things in his life, a lot of good and a lot of bad, but he had never seen anything quite like this. A community united by courage, a love forged in the crucible of adversity, a new beginning rising from the ashes of the old. He knew that the West would always be a wild and unpredictable place, a land of hardship and danger. But he also knew that it was a land of hope, a land where anything was possible, a land where even the most broken souls could find redemption. He tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode off into the sunset, leaving Sarah and Caleb to build their new life together in the town that they had helped to save. His work here was done. The dust settled on Redemption, but the echoes of gunfire still rang in Caleb's ears. Freedom had been bought, but with it came a weight he hadn't anticipated. The letter, once a symbol of a life he'd abandoned, now sat heavy in his pocket, a deed to a past he barely remembered, a future he wasn't sure he wanted. He found Sarah mending fences, her hands calloused but sure. The setting sun cast long shadows, painting the landscape in hues of orange and purple. It was a scene of quiet resilience, a stark contrast to the opulent world he'd left behind. "Boston's a long way from here," she said, her voice soft, not looking up from her work. She knew. The letter, the implications, were as clear to her as the vast expanse of the plains. Caleb knelt beside her, picking up a stray nail. "It is," he agreed. "A different world, really." He wanted to tell her about the grand houses, the bustling streets, the expectations that came with a name like Stone. But the words felt hollow, inadequate in the face of her quiet strength. He'd seen the grit in her eyes, the way she'd rallied the town, the unwavering loyalty she held for those she cared for. It was a strength money couldn't buy. The town had started rebuilding. Hammers rang, saws buzzed, and the spirit of redemption, once crushed, now flickered with a renewed intensity. Caleb, however, felt like an outsider again, caught between two worlds. He helped where he could, mucking stalls, repairing roofs. But the fortune whispered in his ear, a constant reminder of the life he could reclaim. The cowboy, ever observant, watched Caleb's internal struggle. He'd seen men broken by wealth, corrupted by power. He'd seen it change them into something unrecognizable. He didn't speak, but his presence was a steady reminder of the values redemption held dear: hard work, honesty, and community. One evening, Caleb found the cowboy sitting by the campfire, the flames dancing in his weathered face. Grumble lay at his feet, snoring softly. "Heard tell you're a rich man now," the cowboy said, his voice raspy. It wasn't a question. Caleb sighed, running a hand through his hair. "So it seems. Money can be a powerful thing," the cowboy continued, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Can build empires, or tear 'em down. Depends on the hand that wields it." Caleb remained silent, knowing the cowboy wasn't looking for a response. He was offering a truth, a warning. "This town," the cowboy said, gesturing towards the darkened silhouette of redemption, "it needs help. Blackwood took a lot. Folks are hurting." He paused, letting the words sink in. "A man with your resources, he could make a real difference." The cowboy's words resonated deeply. Caleb had seen the poverty, the desperation in the eyes of the townsfolk. He knew Blackwood's greed had left deep scars. He could return to Boston, live a life of ease, but could he turn his back on the people who had risked everything for him? Could he abandon Sarah, the woman who had shown him the meaning of true courage? The next morning, Caleb made his decision. He gathered the townsfolk in the center of redemption. He stood before them, not as a wealthy heir, but as one of their own. "I received word," he began, his voice clear and strong, "that I've inherited my family's estate. It's a considerable sum." A murmur rippled through the crowd. He held up his hand, silencing them. "I've thought long and hard about what to do with this money," he continued. "I could return to Boston, live a life of luxury, but that's not who I am anymore." He looked at Sarah, her eyes filled with understanding. "I've found my home here, in redemption, and I intend to stay." A cheer erupted from the crowd. Caleb smiled, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't known he was missing. "I'm going to use this inheritance to rebuild redemption," he announced, "to help those who have been hurt by Blackwood, to create a future where everyone has a chance to thrive." He outlined his plans: to rebuild the school, to establish a fund for struggling farmers, to create new businesses that would provide jobs for the townsfolk. He spoke of a redemption where everyone had a voice, where justice prevailed, where community thrived. The townsfolk listened, their faces filled with hope. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. Now, with Caleb's help, they could build a brighter future, a future where redemption truly lived up to its name. Sarah watched Caleb, her heart swelling with pride. He had chosen the harder path, the path of service and sacrifice. He had proven that wealth didn't define a man, that true riches lay in the bonds of community and the courage to do what was right. The cowboy, leaning against a post, nodded in approval. He had seen the potential in Caleb, the seed of goodness that had been buried beneath layers of privilege and circumstance. He had watched him choose the West, choose redemption, choose Sarah. And in that choice, he had found his own redemption. The West remained wild, untamed. But in the heart of redemption, a small act of mercy had blossomed into something extraordinary. A community reborn, a love found, and a fortune used not for personal gain, but for the greater good. The story of Caleb Stone, the reluctant heir, was just beginning. The dust of the gunfight had barely settled when Caleb set to work. The first order of business was the schoolhouse. Blackwood, in his greed, had let it fall to ruin, leaving the children of redemption without a proper place to learn. Caleb, remembering his own privileged education, felt a pang of guilt and a fierce determination to provide something better for the town's young ones. He hired a skilled carpenter from a neighboring town, a man named Silas with calloused hands and a quiet demeanor. Together, they drew up plans for a new schoolhouse, one that would be sturdy, well lit, and equipped with the tools necessary for learning. Sarah, with her practical knowledge and unwavering spirit, was instrumental in the design, suggesting features that would make the schoolhouse a true center of the community. The townsfolk pitched in, donating their time and labor. Men hammered and sawed, women sewed curtains and prepared meals, and even the children helped by gathering stones and clearing debris. It was a collective effort, a testament to the resilience and unity of redemption. As the schoolhouse rose from the ashes, Caleb turned his attention to the struggling farmers. Blackwood had squeezed them dry with unfair prices and exorbitant loans, leaving many on the brink of ruin. Caleb established a fund to provide them with low-interest loans, allowing them to purchase new equipment, improve their irrigation systems, and weather the inevitable droughts and hardships of frontier life. He also encouraged them to diversify their crops, moving beyond the single cash crop that Blackwood had forced upon them. He brought in experts to teach them new farming techniques, introducing them to drought-resistant varieties and sustainable practices. He knew that a healthy and diversified agricultural economy was essential for the long-term prosperity of redemption. Sarah, with her understanding of the land and her keen business sense, played a vital role in this endeavor. She organized workshops, helped farmers navigate the complexities of the new loan program, and even experimented with her own garden, demonstrating the benefits of innovative farming methods. Her quiet leadership and unwavering support inspired confidence and fostered a sense of community among the farmers. Beyond agriculture, Caleb saw the need for new businesses that would provide jobs and opportunities for the townsfolk. He invested in a blacksmith shop, a general store, and a small sawmill, ensuring that they were run fairly and ethically. He encouraged local artisans and craftsmen to showcase their work, creating a market for their goods and supporting the growth of a vibrant local economy. He also established a trust fund for the elderly and infirm, ensuring that they would have a safety net in their time of need. He knew that many of them had been exploited by Blackwood, and he wanted to provide them with the dignity and security they deserved. As redemption began to thrive, Caleb and Sarah found themselves working side by side, their partnership growing stronger with each passing day. They were a team, complementing each other's strengths and supporting each other's weaknesses. Caleb provided the resources and the vision, while Sarah provided the heart and the soul. They built a simple but comfortable home on the outskirts of town, a place where they could relax and recharge after a long day of work. They spent their evenings sitting on the porch, watching the sunset and discussing their plans for the future. They dreamed of a redemption where everyone had a chance to succeed, where justice prevailed, and where community thrived. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Sarah turned to Caleb, her eyes filled with love and gratitude. "You've done so much for this town," she said. her voice soft. "You've given us hope, a chance to rebuild our lives." Caleb smiled, taking her hand in his. "It's not just me," he said. "It's all of us. We're building this together." He looked out at the town, at the newly built schoolhouse, at the bustling businesses, at the faces of the townsfolk, now filled with hope and determination. He knew that redemption still faced challenges, that the West would always be a wild and unpredictable place. But he also knew that they had something special here, something that Blackwood could never take away. A sense of community, a spirit of resilience, and a shared commitment to building a better future. The cowboy, watching them from a distance, nodded in approval. He had seen Caleb transform from a reluctant heir into a compassionate leader, a man who had embraced the values of the West and used his wealth to make a real difference in the lives of others. He knew that the road ahead would be long and arduous, but he also knew that Caleb and Sarah, with their unwavering spirit and their deep love for each other and for redemption, were up to the task. The seeds of hope had been sown, and the future, though uncertain, was bright with possibility. The seasons turned, painting the plains in hues of emerald green and golden brown. The new schoolhouse buzzed with the laughter of children, their voices a symphony of hope echoing across redemption. The farms flourished, the fields yielding bountiful harvests. The town, once scarred by fear and oppression, now pulsed with a newfound vitality. But amidst the progress and prosperity, Sarah carried a secret, a silent joy that blossomed within her. The telltale signs, the subtle changes were undeniable. A new life was stirring, a promise of the future nestled within her womb. She shared the news with Caleb one evening as they sat on their porch, the fireflies dancing in the twilight. He had been poring over accounts, ensuring the loan program was running smoothly, his brow furrowed with concern. "Caleb," she began, her voice soft, drawing him from his work. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, a question in their depths. She took his hand, placing it gently on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby." A moment of stunned silence hung in the air, broken only by the chirping of crickets. Then a slow smile spread across Caleb's face, transforming his features. He knelt before her, his eyes filled with wonder and disbelief. "A baby?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Sarah, that's wonderful." He embraced her, holding her close, his heart overflowing with joy. The weight of responsibility, the anxieties of leadership, seemed to melt away in the warmth of their shared happiness. He had found his purpose in redemption, in serving its people, but this was a different kind of fulfillment, a deeper connection to the land and to the future. The news spread quickly through redemption, bringing a wave of excitement and anticipation. The townsfolk rejoiced, offering their congratulations and their support. They knew that Sarah and Caleb's baby would be a symbol of hope, a testament to the resilience of their community. As Sarah's pregnancy progressed, Caleb became increasingly protective, tending to her every need. He learned to cook her favorite meals, read to her in the evenings, and even helped her with her gardening, his awkward attempts often resulting in laughter and gentle teasing. He also spent hours building a cradle, meticulously crafting each piece of wood, his hands guided by love and anticipation. He wanted it to be perfect, a safe and comfortable haven for their child. The cowboy, ever watchful, observed Caleb's transformation with a knowing smile. He had seen men become fathers before, but he had never seen anyone embrace the role with such wholehearted devotion. He knew that Caleb's past, his wealth and privilege, had been stripped away, revealing a man of genuine compassion and unwavering commitment. The birth was long and arduous, but Sarah faced it with her characteristic strength and courage. Caleb stayed by her side, offering words of encouragement and wiping her brow. He felt helpless, watching her endure the pain, but he knew that his presence was a source of comfort and support. Finally, after hours of labor, a cry pierced the air, a sound that resonated with life and hope. A healthy baby girl was born, her tiny face wrinkled and red, her eyes wide with wonder. Caleb held his daughter in his arms, his heart overflowing with love. He looked at Sarah, her face pale but radiant, and felt a surge of gratitude. He had found his true home, not in the gilded halls of Boston, but in the arms of this woman, in the heart of this community, in the promise of this child. They named her Hope, a symbol of their unwavering belief in the future of redemption. Hope Stone. The cowboy, hearing the news, tipped his hat. Another generation was taking root in this harsh land. In the days and weeks that followed, Caleb dedicated himself to being a father. He learned to change diapers, to soothe a crying baby, to sing lullabies in a voice that was surprisingly gentle. He discovered a new side of himself, a tenderness and vulnerability that he had never known existed. He also realized that his responsibilities had grown. He was no longer just the leader of redemption. He was a father, a provider, a protector. He had to ensure that Hope grew up in a world where she could thrive, where she could be safe, where she could pursue her dreams. He renewed his commitment to the town, working tirelessly to improve the lives of its people. He invested in education, in healthcare, in infrastructure, ensuring that redemption would be a place where Hope could grow up healthy, happy, and well-educated. He also spent time teaching her about the land, about the importance of hard work, about the value of community. He wanted her to understand the struggles that the townsfolk had faced, the sacrifices they had made, the resilience they had shown. He wanted her to appreciate the beauty of the West, its vastness, its wildness, its endless possibilities. Sarah, watching Caleb with hope, felt a deep sense of contentment. She had found her soulmate, a man who loved her unconditionally, a man who was dedicated to his family and his community. She knew that their life together wouldn't be easy, that there would be challenges ahead, but she also knew that they could face them together, as a family, bound by love and loyalty. The cowboy, seeing them together, smiled to himself. He had witnessed a transformation, a rebirth, a redemption. Caleb Stone, the reluctant heir, had become a true leader, a loving husband, and a devoted father. He had found his place in the West, not as a wealthy outsider, but as an integral part of the community. He knew that the future of redemption was in good hands. Hope was born. The promise had been kept. The West continued, wild and untamed, but touched by the small acts of mercy and the enduring power of love. Years drifted by, marked by the turning of seasons and the steady growth of redemption. The little schoolhouse, once a dream, now overflowed with children, their eager faces reflecting the light of knowledge. The farms prospered, the fields a patchwork of green and gold under the vast prairie sky. The general store bustled with activity, a testament to the thriving local economy. Caleb and Sarah stood on their porch, the wood weathered by sun and wind, watching the sunset paint the horizon in fiery hues. Hope, no longer a babe in arms, chased fireflies in the yard, her laughter echoing across the land. She was a spirited girl, with her mother's courage and her father's gentle heart. "Another beautiful day," Sarah murmured, leaning against Caleb, her hand resting on his arm. Her hair, streaked with silver now, was pulled back from her face, revealing the familiar lines etched by time and sun. Caleb nodded, his gaze fixed on Hope. "It is," he agreed. "Hard to believe how much things have changed." He thought back to the day he had arrived in Redemption, a man adrift, haunted by a past he couldn't escape. He had been running from a life of privilege and expectation, searching for something he couldn't quite define. He had found it here, in the heart of this small town, in the love of Sarah, and in the joy of fatherhood. He had used his inheritance to rebuild Redemption, to create a community where everyone had a chance to thrive. He had learned that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars and cents, but in the bonds of friendship, the strength of community, and the enduring spirit of the West. "You've done so much for this town, Caleb," Sarah said, her voice filled with pride. "You've given us a future." Caleb shook his head. "We did it together, Sarah," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "You were the heart of this town. You showed me what it meant to be strong, to be resilient, to never give up hope." He remembered the day he had confessed his past to her, the fear that she would reject him, that she would see him as an outsider, a man who didn't belong. But she had embraced him, flaws and all, seeing the goodness beneath the surface. He looked at Hope, her face illuminated by the flickering light of the fireflies, and felt a surge of gratitude. He had been given a second chance, a chance to build a life of meaning and purpose. He wouldn't trade it for all the riches in the world. The cowboy, leaning against the corral fence, watched them from a distance. He had seen them grow together, their love deepening with each passing year. He had seen Caleb transform from a man haunted by his past into a leader who inspired hope and fostered community. He knew that the West was a harsh and unforgiving place, that challenges would always arise. But he also knew that Redemption was strong, that its people were resilient, and that their spirit would never be broken. Hope ran towards them, her laughter ringing out in the twilight. "Papa! Mama, look!" she exclaimed, holding up a jar filled with fireflies. "I caught so many!" Caleb knelt down, taking the jar from her. "They're beautiful, Hope," he said, his voice filled with affection. "But they belong in the sky. Let's set them free." Together, they opened the jar, releasing the fireflies into the night. The tiny lights danced in the air, illuminating the faces of the family, a symbol of hope and freedom. As the last firefly disappeared into the darkness, Caleb stood up, wrapping his arms around Sarah and Hope. He looked out at the town, at the homes illuminated by lamplight, at the fields stretching out to the horizon. He knew that the West would always be a wild and untamed place, but he also knew that Redemption was a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of community and the enduring spirit of the human heart. He had found his home here, in the arms of his family, in the heart of this town. He was Caleb Stone, a rancher, a husband, a father, and a part of Redemption. He was home. The cowboy, watching the scene unfold, nodded in approval. He had seen the seeds of hope planted, nurtured, and blossom into something beautiful. He knew that the story of Redemption was far from over, but he also knew that its future was bright, illuminated by the love of a family and the unwavering spirit of a community. The sun set, casting long shadows across the prairie. But in the heart of redemption, hope shone bright.